Pokemon Emerald. A classic, a fan favorite, and also just so happens to be my Grail Pokemon game. And well, I've actually finally acquired it. Now what does one do when acquiring the Grail game? Spend hours catching every possible in-game Pokemon? Beat the Elite Four? Perhaps shiny hunt all the legendaries? All correct answers, but there's one thing left. A certificate. A digital piece of paper telling me I'm the very best. That, and the love and approval from Prof.Brasher himself. Wait, really? That's all you have to say? Anyways, that's the dream. Now how hard could it really be, right? I've already got Emerald, so I shouldn't have to deal with any version exclusives. Wrong! Okay, well, I already own LeafGreen and FireRed, so I should be able to get every Kanto and Johto Pokemon needed, right? Wrong! Okay, this is ridiculous. Now after a lot of research, I began to realize this was not going to be a cheap or easy task. Let's get into it. So I've divided this into three categories: Gameboy Advance, or GBA for short, GameCube, and hardware. Yes, ladies and gents, this mission I've decided to embark on will span across multiple games, multiple regions across multiple consoles, spin-offs, a whole lot of time, and a burning hole in my wallet. Please leave a like, I need all the motivation I can get. Now before we start, let me preface by saying this task is not cheap by any means, and because I'm such a super fan, or maybe I'm just crazy and have a massive Pokemon addiction, for the past few years I've been working towards collecting every single Pokemon game complete in box, so any purchases I make for this are all going to be good condition, complete in box examples, so it's going to be a lot more pricey, and there's definitely cheaper ways to go about this if that's what you're wanting. Category 1, Game Boy Advance. Let's start things off by checking the Hoenn Index off our list. Now like mentioned earlier, there is actually a few Hoenn Pokemon that aren't obtainable in Emerald, those being Meditite, Metachan, Surskit, Masquerain, Roselia, Zangoose, and Lunatone. That being said, keep in mind Zangoose is a Ruby exclusive and Lunatone is a Sapphire exclusive. So that means I'll now need to get both Ruby and Sapphire to grab the missing Hoenn Pokemon, and whilst playing them, I might as well pick the other two starters I'm missing. Now all that leaves me left with is Latias or Latios. In Emerald, you have a choice of picking either one, so all that means is I'll have to grab the opposite one I choose from either Ruby or Sapphire. Now with that done, all I'll need is Clamperl's trait evolutions and the Hoenn Index is complete. Is what I would say, but there's two Hoenn Pokemon left. Now this is where things get kinda complicated. Throughout this entire challenge, there are technically two Pokemon that are completely unobtainable legitly now in all of these Gen 3 era games. One of which being Deoxys. This alien of a Pokemon was given away during a one-day only event in only 3 locations in the US in 2004. Meaning if you weren't born at the time, you were too young, you lived too far away, etc., you just couldn't get Deoxys. Yeah, I know. Pokemon not thinking about future accessibility? Who would have thought? As for the last Hoenn Pokemon, we'll circle back to that. Anyways, this basically leaves me with only 2 options for getting the Aurora ticket to experience the long-lost Deoxys event. Use a Flash Cart and download the event from leaked distribution carts, or do a tedious glitch which is known for causing corrupt data. Me personally, I'm not risking all the time I've spent on this already, so the Flash Cart will probably be my choice, but pick your poison. Next up, the Kanto Dex. Now the Kanto Dex will require me to get both FireRed and LeafGreen, which thankfully I already have in order to get all the version exclusives, but that being said, there is one Kanto Pokemon that I cannot get in those games. That being Mr. 151 himself, Mew. That's right, the second and final Pokemon throughout this challenge that cannot legitimately be obtained. So like Deoxys, I'll have to use a Flash Cart with the downloaded event in order to get Mew to my Emerald cartridge, because just like Deoxys and the Aurora ticket, the Deep Sea map to unlock the Mew event is also unobtainable now. Now that leaves us with Johto. Since there's no actual Johto games on the Game Boy Advance, all the Johto Pokemon are going to have to be obtained across multiple games. I won't bore you with the specifics, so to keep it brief, there's some you can get in FireRed and LeafGreen, some in the GameCube games, and some you can get in Emerald Safari Zone, though keep in mind Emerald introduced 2 new areas to the Safari Zone that contain additional Johto Pokemon, but they can't be accessed until you reach the Hall of Fame. So, remember how I mentioned there's multiple ways of getting some Pokemon? Well, here comes a few. The Legendary Dogs and the Johto Starters. The Legendary Dogs can be obtained in FireRed and LeafGreen, but it is a roaming encounter and you're only limited to 1, and which one that is depends on your starter. That, and while both Raikou and Entei have access to the move Roar, which doesn't seem horrible, right? Well, due to a glitch in FireRed and LeafGreen, Roar for some reason counts as a Pokemon fainting instead of them just fleeing from battle. So if they use Roar, the battle ends and they technically faint, meaning there's no way to encounter them again. Smart, Game Freak. Real smart. Thankfully, there's an easier way, which we'll get into later. Now, like the dogs, the starters are also obtainable in Emerald, but once again, aren't very efficient. In Emerald, if you catch every single Hoenn Pokemon, you can talk to the professor and he'll allow you to choose one of the Johto starters. Not horrible, but it's going to require you either completing the Hoenn Dex in every single game or wasting a bunch of time transferring all the Hoenn Pokemon from Emerald to your Ruby to your Sapphire and then back to Emerald. And like the dogs, there is a much easier way, which brings us into our next category, GameCube. Let's kick things off with an honorable mention, Pokemon Box. Ah yes, the original Pokemon Home. Due to this game's limited print and ways to obtain it back in the day, it is now extremely expensive, but the PAL versions are a bit cheaper and will still work with some minor workarounds. That being said, this is by no means necessary, but it will make transferring Pokemon a whole lot easier. And, well, I need it for the collection, so for our first actual GameCube game, we'll be picking up a copy of Colleseum. This will help us snag a few Pokemon we're missing, and some will just make our life a whole lot easier, like starting the game with Espeon and Umbreon, which will save us time with friendship evolutions, as well as some Pokemon being easier to get in these games, such as Entei, Raikou, and Suicune, like mentioned earlier. On top of those, we can actually get the mid-stages of the Johto starters, which will be a big time saver as well. Next on our list is going to be none other than Ho-Oh himself. Now before you ask, yes, Ho-Oh was available at one time in Emerald, but like Deoxys and Mew, it's impossible to get now. Now sure, I could use a Flash Cart in order to unlock the event like I'm going to with Deoxys and Mew, but I'm trying to do this as legit as possible, and unlike those two, thankfully there is still a way to get a legit Ho-Oh into Emerald, and that, ladies and gents, involves 100 straight battles in Mound Battle. After 100 grueling matches in Colleseum, your reward is none other than Ho-Oh himself. Now what about Lugia, you ask? Well, that brings us into our next game, Pokemon Gale of Darkness XD. This game is mainly going to provide us with some time savers like fully evolved Pokemon, pseudos, as well as some hard Safari encounters like Chansey, all things which are obtainable in the other games but will just save us time in leveling, evolving, and catching. The main thing we're after is Lugia. After catching him during the boss battle, we'll be able to purify him into a regular old Lugia and transfer him into Emerald. Now we're almost done, but 2 Pokemon remain. Remember that last Hoenn Pokemon I said we'd get back to? Well, that's Jirachi. Now it is easy to get, but not so easy on the wallet. Yeah, to get him, you're gonna need to buy the Pokemon Colleseum bonus disc. So, not very hard to get him, just expensive. Now as for the final Pokemon on our list, it is none other than the Onion Fairy himself, Celebi. Now how do you get a Celebi, you ask? Well, just another bonus disc. But not just any bonus disc. It was Japan's Colleseum bonus disc. And you know what that means? No? Well, I'll tell you. That means not only will I need the Japanese bonus disc, but I'll also need a Japanese GameCube, and I'll also need a Japanese copy of Colleseum, and I'll also need to beat the game in Japanese to even redeem the Celebi, and the cherry on top, I'll need a copy of Ruby or Sapphire in Japanese to be able to transfer the Celebi to that Game Boy game, and then from that Japanese Game Boy game to my Emerald. And that, ladies and gents, is how you complete a living dex in Pokemon Emerald. As for the hardware, there'll be a complete list of everything I used, whether necessary or not, in the description. Until next time, keep exploring, keep catching, and as always, stay legendary.